and I don't think I'm gonna get to the second one until like March, but or the third one. What? Numbers! Hello everybody, my name is Kelsey, and we're about to get very, very nerdy with all the books that I read in January. Why is this my thing? I turned into like an evil villain. I just need a cat. So January was a pretty decent rating month for me as far as how many books I read, what I read, things like that. I ended up reading a total of 9 books, which was awesome. As far as the total page count, I read a total of 2,775 pages, and among those 9 books, I read 4 physically, 4 audiobook, and 1 ebook. Now, as far as the age range on my books, I ended up reading 4 middle grade, 3 young adult, and 2 adult books. My genres were kind of all over the place, so I ended up reading 3 fantasy, 2 contemporary, 1 classic, 1 sci-fi, and 2 nonfiction. And in my star rating, I have them, like I said, kind of all over the place. So I read 1 5-star, 4 4-stars, 3 3-stars, and 1 2-star book. But since we have 9 books to talk about, we should get started, and I will do them in the order that I always do, which is the order I read them in. So my very, very first book of 2020 was Legendary Ladies by Anne Shin. This was one of the ones that I pulled from my nonfiction TBR jar, and I was pretty disappointed with this book. I ended up giving this book 3 stars because the art style is still one of my favorite things. I absolutely love Anne Shin's art style, but I think for me, the problem was there was no depth to any of these people. It was very kind of surface level, here's who they are, and sometimes you wouldn't even tell the story of who these individual, like, legends and mythological, like, women are. She would just be like, here is a few things that people, worship them for, and then move on. And I was like, but who are they, and, like, what are they the god of? Or, like, how did they become who they are? And I felt like I didn't get that. I will say, as far as her layout goes, I found it really, really interesting because every single page had a beautiful illustration of the person, but she also had the origin, so you knew where this came from. For example, this one is from Hawaii, and then she goes into kind of their mythology in a sense, and then at the very bottom, it's kind of how you can, for lack of a better word, use this guide. So for example, this one, it says, call on Peely when you're looking for strength and following your own convictions. So like, this feels like a resource book, so that if you were really, really into kind of like spirituality and you want to use a bunch of different religions, then this is your guide to that. But I was really looking for more of just like information about all of these women, and I feel like I got very, very little. And the writing of those individual parts wasn't amazing. I remember when I read her other book, which was Bad Women Throughout History, it wasn't amazing, but they were like little biographies about these women, so I didn't really think, either way. But this one really showed that, like, to me, I don't like the way that she writes. My favorite part of this was the introduction, which is a little bit sad. But I love her art style, which is why it, stayed to a 3. And when she did dive into the stories, because there are some that got like one itty bitty paragraph, and then there are some that got like an entire page. And when she did go into like the individual women and their story, it was really interesting, and I did enjoy it. But I feel like we didn't get that for a lot of them. We only got them for like a handful. Not my favorite. I'm pretty disappointed with this one, but the art style was amazing, so I was okay. The second book that I ended up picking up was The Wide Window, the third in the series of Unfortunate Events series by Lemony Snicket. Now, I ended up giving this one 3 to 3.5 stars. I know the first 3 stories really, really well. This was a reread, so I did know kind of what was going on in the story. I remember it, like I said, really, really well, but it was just boring. Like, I didn't feel that sense of danger. I didn't feel that sense of urgency that I kind of did in the last 2. Also, the whole, like, house that they stay in with Aunt Josephine and how it, like, is barely attached to a cliff really stresses me out, and I don't think I'd be able to live in it if I was these kids, because no. I do have a lot of the same types of feelings about this one that I do with the past two. Is the writing is very simple. He does go into a lot of definitions for some of the words that you might not understand. It's a very cookie cutter story, just kind of like the first few Harry Potters are, where they go to school for a year, something happens, they solve it, the end. They go to school for a year. So it's like that, except for these kids are going to a bunch of different families, and Count Olaf is trying to steal their money. I'm really ready for kind of like the end of the series, where it starts to not be as cookie cutter as it is with these first few. But I'm glad I read it. I think as of right now, this is my least favorite in the series. I do enjoy going back into the world and being with these characters, but like I knew going into this one that this wasn't going to be my favorite. So I'm excited to continue on to one that like is a little bit better. The next one is one that's probably one of my most anticipated releases of last year, and I finally got around to it, and that is The Queen of Nothing by Holly Black, which is the third and final in the Folk of the Air series. This was good. This wasn't my favorite of the series. I want to say that maybe The Wicked King might have been my favorite of the series. I'm not entirely convinced on that one. But this one definitely had some of my favorite moments in it. Before I went into this book, I had seen a couple of reviews of it, and a lot of people were saying that there is a lot more romance into this book, which I was there for, because I am totally there for the romance. And so I was very, very excited about this. Now, while they do focus a little bit more on the romance in this book, I still think the main kind of political intrigue and a lot of the shiftiness, for lack of a better word, that happens in the first two, and the plotting, that's what I'm looking for. A lot of the plotting and the sneakiness is totally a thing in this book. It's just that the romance like bumps up a little bit. There is more in this book, but it didn't take away from the things that like people who enjoy the series would like about the first two. I will say that I did feel disconnected from the characters in this one for some reason. I don't know if it's like, I don't quite know why I felt disconnected, but they did kind of feel a little bit 2D to me. So I felt just like not like they didn't feel the same as they were in the first two. I also feel like at the end there was a little bit of a really quick wrap up, and that one of these characters has been fighting for something this entire series, and then right as they're about to get it, they go, "Oh, I lose, you win, yay!" And you're like, "That's not what that character would do." And I feel like she was just trying to wrap that part up really, really quickly, because, like I said, I don't feel like that character would do that specific thing. If you've read this book, you know what I'm talking about. But I did really, really enjoy it, so I did end up giving this one 4 stars, but like I said, it's not my favorite in the series. The next one that I picked up, I actually picked up in December for one of the Magical Readathon prompts, and then I ended up not using it, but I was reading it and enjoying it, so I decided to continue reading it, and that is Somewhere Only We Know by Maureen Gu. This is about K-pop, basically, and a K-pop star. This reminds me a whole lot of The Sun Is Also a Star, because it's these two people going through a city in basically one entire day, and that's just what it felt like. I think I ended up giving this one 3 stars, but it felt very cookie cutter romance book. It's a very, very cute story about 2 people who may or may not fall in love, and about finding love and finding passion and finding love for like the art that you create. Because the girl in this is a K-pop star, and the boy is basically a paparazzi right now, but he wants to do photography, like that's his passion. And so they talk a lot about passion and what that means, and following your dreams, things like that. So all of that stuff was really, really good. I did enjoy it. I felt like we spent a lot of the time with the characters, so we did end up getting to know them really, really well. I just don't feel a certain way about them. I don't want you to think it was bad, because I did enjoy myself when I was reading it. I just don't have any like strong opinions about it. The next one that I ended up picking up was Sent by Margaret Patterson Haddix. This is the second in the Missing series, and this is going to be one that's going to be really, really hard for me to talk about, because the end of the first one reveals like a huge, huge plot point that like twists the rest of the books. And like, I can't even tell you the location. I can't tell you what happens without spoiling the end of the first one, which is very hard for me. So I'm going to see if I can figure out how to do this. I did end up giving this one 4 stars because there are some aspects of historical fiction in this book, and it does take place at a time period that I love, and I think getting a modern day look at that time period was really, really interesting, and I did enjoy this a whole lot. This is really good at being a middle grade, so it's got all of those like fantastical elements and things like that, but while you're reading it, you're kind of forgetting that you are reading a middle grade, except for the fact that the characters in it are young and kind of mention that a few times. And beyond that, I think that this is definitely targeted toward middle grade readers, but like you can forget if you're really invested in the story that it is a middle grade. Like, I can't talk about this without like spoiling anything, but I did really, really enjoy this. It was very, very good. The whole like plot point at the end of the first one that like basically like sends this one into high gear is really, really creative, and I love that and never would have even thought of that as a plot, and I just find it fantastic, and it was very good. The next one is probably my second favorite book of the month, and that is The Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy by Mackenzie Lee. Now, this is the one that I picked from my fiction TBR jar, and I don't know if it's because I've been removed from the first one so much that I totally forgot anything from the first book, but holy crap, I love this one. I ended up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars. It was so good. It was so good. I'm so glad that I went back into this world. This talks a lot about women, so it's very, very feminist, and that she wants to be a doctor, and she talks a lot about how women are not allowed to be doctors and how she wants to change that, and she wants to be her own person and stuff like that, and that comes up a lot in this book. I liked the entire plot line of this. We get to see Felicity and one of her friends from childhood that we don't meet in the first one, but comes to play in this one, and it's just fantastic to see the two of them together, and it makes me so happy. My favorite thing about the entire story is the writing style, and like I said, I don't remember if I just forgot how she wrote books or wasn't really invested in the story when I read the first one. I'd really like to reread it to see if I'm correct in my thought, but it's so funny. It's such a sassy way of writing. I love it. I love it. I love it so much. Another thing I really enjoyed about this book was kind of the world and how she built the world, because this is a historical fiction book that has fantasy aspects to it, and the way that she writes the world makes sense, and so like these fantasy things like having place in historical fiction doesn't surprise you. It feels very, very believable that these fantasy aspects could actually happen in this world that she describes, which I think is phenomenal. I will say one thing which I totally didn't notice about the first one, and I don't know if it was in the first one or if it's just more pronounced in this one, is this book is definitely a YA book. However, there are jokes made that are very adult jokes, and you sit there and go, I'm sorry, did he just say the thing that I think he just said? It's mostly Monty. Monty is very, very vulgar, and some of the jokes that he makes about him and Percy in front of Felicity, like, anyway, it was funny. I like Monty. I love the banter. I think she's really good at writing banter. I think that she does a very good job at summarizing book one without telling you what happened, so I feel like you can read these out of order. So will it make more sense to read The Gentleman of Vice and Virtue before you read this one? Of course. But I feel like you can read this book and be okay with not reading the first one and still understand everything, because anytime that she needs to explain, something about the characters, she does it in a pretty decent way so that you don't feel lost if you hadn't read the first one. Like I said, I would definitely suggest reading the first one before you read this one because it makes you care about a lot of the situations more, but I feel like she does a good job of being able, like, letting you be able to read it out of order if you wanted to. The family relationships in this book are amazing. The friendships in this book are amazing. It just gives me a lot of joy. The next book is the one that is probably my least favorite of the month, which makes me pretty sad, and that is Greek Legends and Stories by M.B. Seton Williams. This is the second one that I picked for my TBR jar, and I couldn't decide which one I wanted to read, so I read both of them. But I did end up giving this one 2 stars. So, the best way that I can describe this book is it felt like Spark Notes for the Greek stories. Like, she's not retelling them, she's not just putting them all in one book, she's giving you the highlights of the stories and then moving on to the next one. The longest stories in this book were later on when she kind of talks about the Odyssey and kind of talks about the Trojan War. And those were about 5 or 6 pages each, but most stories in this book are like 2 or 3. And they're interesting, and if you like Greek mythology, this is a good kind of like starting point, reference point if you wanted just like the highlights of the stories. But if you wanted more in-depth actual storytelling, this didn't do it. There is a lot of telling not showing in this book, which I understand. This is a reference book. It's not supposed to be like showing you what's going on, but I thought that she was going to be retelling these stories. That's what the cover made it sound like. That's what the inside jacket made it sound like, and that's not what happened. If you just wanted to know the bare minimum, this was what you needed to do. It was okay. I will say that one thing that I did enjoy about this is that she is incredibly knowledgeable about all of these things, but she writes it and that she's incredibly knowledgeable, so she throws all of these names at you that you don't understand, and the first like chapter, for lack of a better word, is kind of an introduction. And I think the point of it was she was trying to show you, because there's a map in this book, and she's trying to show you how all of these stories like connect, but she says it in such a boring way that like I can't even tell you a thing about what the introduction is about. But she does mention that like a lot of the stories come from Homer and some of the people who came after Homer, so it's really hard to write down where the actual stories started and if these stories are the actual original stories or it's just because they were told verbally, this is what we have now. And then on a couple of these stories, she does also tell you where the legend and actual real life things connect. Not very often, it's only like 2 of the stories in here, but for example, like one story, there's a bunch of groups of people, and this person basically like made them all become one group of people, and like they're now one city. And then she says, now whether or not this person's actually what caused this, these people did all come together and create this one city. So I find it interesting that she kind of tells you where the legend and real life do kind of align, but I didn't care. I wanted it to be over, and I was really just reading it to read it. But don't worry, because I followed that up with my favorite book of the month, and that was the second in the School for Good and Evil series, A World Without Princes. Now, this takes place right after the events of the first one, so I ended up giving this one 5 stars because it was just so much fun. And there's a lot about the first one that I felt about. This one, it's always something is always happening. There's always action. It's action packed. Even when it's like in between times and it's not as like action, like fighting action, but like something is happening to engage you in the story, which I find fabulous. It also talks a lot about these 2 friends, and it tests their friendship, and it tests what's good and what's evil and what makes up a villain or a hero. And I think that the first one did a good job of like touching on it, but this one goes way more into depth on it because Sophie is so focused on wanting to be a good person and not being evil. I really, really enjoy Somanchani's writing style because it's very, very atmospheric. I don't think it's complex, but this story, I think, transcends age bounds because this is technically a middle grade, but I forget that it's a middle grade almost the entire time that I am reading it. You feel like you're really there with these people, even though like this world is one that we've already been in, it's now changed, and so like you see the changes in it, and the way he describes it is just amazing, and I love it so much. I don't really know what to say about this book without trying to spoil the first one, but there's a whole lot of like best friend versus boy in this book, and like making someone choose between those 2 and how hard that is, which I think is a very, very adult topic that a lot of people in relationships struggle with, and this is just like the middle grade take on it, which I thought was fantastic. I never even thought to put that in a middle grade book, and I think that I think that So Much and I did a very good job at that. Like, he puts these adult topics and adult themes in this book, but in such a clever way that kids start to understand and start to kind of deal with these ideas and think about them and what they can really do, so that when they become adults, they're kind of already percolating in your mind. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was fantastic. I am so invested in these people, and I want to know what's going to happen, because I feel like everything wraps up in these books and like the last chapter, and then you're like left with all of these feelings of wait, no, what? And like, it is a good end. Like, it is an end to a book, but it's just like you need to know instantly where the story goes. And the very, very last book that I read in January is probably the one that I have the most thoughts on. So we've been here for a while. And that is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Now, going into this, I will say that I knew all of the major plot points. I had Googled this book like a long, long time ago. And so I knew all of the major plot points. I just didn't know how we got to all of them. Basically, I didn't know the like path we took to get to all the stops, but I knew all the stops, if that makes any sense. I was also really curious because a lot of people categorize this as middle grade, and I was wondering how that would work since it's such a classic. But, so, before I start, I will say that I did end up giving this one 4 stars. However, I really didn't like the first part. This book is set into book 1 and book 2, and I felt like the overall plot of the story didn't get started until right before book 2 started, and that's when I started getting invested in these people. I could care less about what was happening at the very beginning of the book. And I realized that is important because it does kind of give you who these 4 sisters are, give you more about them, give you all of the important players that will play a big part. Almost all of them will play a big part in the end of the book, but it was very, very boring to me because it felt like every single chapter, the kids would do something, they would tell their mother about it, and for better or worse, the mother would be like, well, now you've learned your lesson, and you will never do it again, and the kids never did. The end. Next chapter. So it felt like very a day in their life for most of the book. And like, we do get introduced to a lot of big people, like Lori, their friend and neighbor. He comes in relatively early on, and like, he plays a huge part of all of their lives. But like, that beginning was just like, I didn't care about what was happening until the plot really got started, which, like I said, happened about halfway through the book. But once we did get to that, I was really invested. I wanted to pick it up. I was having trouble picking it up at first. I didn't ever like feel myself wanting to pick up this book. I just did because I knew I needed to finish it. And then when book 2 started, I was like there. I wanted to pick it up. I finished book 1 in like 3 days, and then I ended up book 2 in like a day because like I really wanted to know what was happening. And the ending was very, very good. I was very invested. I loved seeing the character growth from the beginning to the end. So the beginning does have purpose. I'm not saying that the beginning doesn't have purpose. I'm saying the beginning's purpose is very hard if you're like me and you're very plot driven. If you're character driven, you're going to love the beginning because you're learning about all these girls and individually things that are happening in their lives which shape them and make them who they end up by the end. The writing style in this book was really interesting for me because it is definitely more complex than like today's writing style, but it is definitely a middle grade and definitely more simple as far as like classical writing styles go. So if you want to get into classics, I feel like this is a good one to start with as far as like the language is, because they're said differently and they're phrased differently, and they use a lot of terms that like still make sense to you, but like you don't use it on a daily basis, but they do in this book. So I think this, like I said, is a good like gateway as far as if you want to get into classics. I did also enjoy that because this is kind of like a character study or like a history, if you will, of these 4 sisters, that when one of them, you know, gets married and has a happily ever after, that's usually where the story ends, but it doesn't. You still get parts of their married life. When they have kids, some of the difficulties they have with their spouse, and then eventually figuring it out. I found that really, really interesting because they didn't just forget about that sister. they continued to put her in the story because she was still part of the family, which I enjoyed. I like that it wasn't just like happily ever after and we never hear from that person again and now we're gonna move on. No, you still got bits and pieces from those people's lives. I am really glad that I did end up reading this one. It was a process to get through, but I did enjoy this one, which is why I did end up giving it 4 stars despite how rough the beginning was. But like I said, I totally understand why the beginning is there. So those are the 9 books that I ended up reading. Some of these are upside down, aren't they? All of them are upside down. All right, so those, if I can hold them up, are the 9 books that I ended up reading in the month of January. Pretty proud with this list. Let me know down below if you have read any of these books and what you thought on them, if your ratings align with mine, or a book that you just ended up loving in the month of January. I'd love to know what you guys are currently reading. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, if you liked this video, make sure to give it a big thumbs up and subscribe down below if you want to be part of this awesome growing family. And I will see you guys in my next video.